Welcome to my podcast, The Sexual Shaman, Conversations on Sexuality and Spirituality. I am your host, Kenneth Stubbs. This podcast videocast series is inspired by a book I envisioned, contributed to, edited, and published 30 years ago entitled Women of the Light, the New Sacred Prostitute. This current podcast is a series of conversations with both women and men of the light, all about sexuality and spirituality. Here we openly support all sexual orientations, all genders, all gender identifications, all races, and all ethnicities. The sponsor of this podcast is my energy training, an extensive 20-course program in generating our intrinsic energy and transforming ourselves and others. More information is available at sexualshaman.com. Welcome to the Sexual Shaman podcast, conversations on sexuality and spirituality. I'm Kenneth Stubbs, and my guest again today is Penn Baker. A few weeks ago, we did another podcast, which I entitled The Two-Spirit Shamanic View of Gender, where Penn shared about her life and conceptualizations around gender. She said at the afterwards that one of the topics she wanted to go into, but we did not have time, and I thought that'd be a very important topic to go into because some recent developments in her life have, in her shamanic journey, have taken her into what I'm terming today the shamanic teacher plants and ceremony, following her experiences in the Cree and Lakota cultures, as she will explain more, looking at the use of the value of what could be called teacher plants or teacher medicines in a ceremonial way, which is a little bit different than our hippie day tripping, I think, as a general approach. And Penn said she'd like to start off with a preamble here of introducing. So, Penn, welcome back, my dear friend. Welcome back. Good to dance with you again. We don't have the drum, we don't have the circle, but we do have the energy.
And we do have that. Thank you, Ray, for asking me to be here. Or maybe I just kind of hornswoggled my way in. I think it's important, at least for me, to kind of set the stage. I'm not going to feed the energy of what happened when I was growing up, but suffice it to say it was a rough childhood. And by the time I was 14, I was drinking alcohol to self-medicate. When I left home, went into the service. Service is a really great place to be an alcoholic. Right after I got out of the service, I went into the commercial power industry, which is highly regulated as to how much alcohol you can drink and whether or not you use any substances. So the bulk of my life, up until I turned 75, I was pretty much clean and sober. Whether I wanted to or not, and most of the time it never crossed my mind that I would wander over that line. When I started my path as an earth walker with the Cree Nation and an elder by the name of Leonard Cardinal, whom is spiritually referred to as Little Skunk, the Cree Nation had a horrible time with drugs and alcohol. So the rules for Leonard were, if you're going to fast with me, you can't have used any alcohol, you can't have used any drugs for 1 year prior to the fast. I fasted 7 years in a row, do the math, no drugs, no alcohol for 7 years. There were other rules. In that period of time, I made a trip to Peru. And I met the master shaman of Cusco, Peru. And I sat with him, and his teacher plant was peyote. And he and I sat there, and I entertained the thought of using peyote. And Victor looked at me and said, peyote is not your medicine. Your medicine is grandmother ayahuasca, the grandmother plant. And you should look for that. Moving right along, about 2 years ago, I met with a group of folks, 4 of us, who had had similar childhood experiences, and we became a support group for one another. At one point or another, we decided to use magic mushroom. Now, there's some technical names that people use for magic mushroom, and that's because people want to make themselves sound bigger. In my mind's eye, this is my opinion. I'm thoroughly convinced that people walking through the fields looking for mushrooms didn't call them. Ray, help me. What's the name for what's the technical name for magic mushrooms?
It's called psilocybin mushrooms.
Psilocybin mushrooms. I'm thoroughly convinced that the Celts never called them psilocybin. just saying.
Yeah, that's a chemical name that somehow the chemists came up with that name for whatever reason.
Yep. Here's the piece that we always do. There's 4 of us. One of us is always the guide, so they don't use any of the teacher plant. The other 3 or 1 or 2 may use a small amount or a large amount of magic mushroom. There is always smudging beforehand. We always give thanks to the plant for giving its life so we can live. I'm going to roll backwards a moment. When I sundanced, I'm not going to use the Sundance chief's name here because it's not going to be a great thing that happens right here. He had the same rules about drugs and alcohol before he went to the Sundance, but he smoked about 3 packs of cigarettes a day. He came down with lung cancer, and he said, someone put a curse on me. And I said to him, did you pray every time before you used the sacred tobacco as a cigarette? And his answer was no. Told him you did not have the right relation with a sacred plant. You abused it. It's now abusing you. When we use medicines, medicine plants, medicines, if we don't give thanks to that plant, if we don't have a solid intention when we use that plant, in my mind, this is my understanding. Y'all can have any understanding you want. My understanding is that plant will go wherever it wants to go. It's a free spirit also. I haven't asked that spirit to help me. So when I ask the spirit to help me in a kind of loving and gentle way, the plant says, oh, this 2-legged needs help, and I'm here to help him. So that's my preamble to teacher medicines, teacher plants. When we started the conversation, I think Ray's going to lead me a little bit into this. Ray uses the term teacher plants. I use the term teacher medicines, and there's a reason for it, and I'm going to let Ray lead me into that.
All right. Well, again, this is an open conversation. We may or may not have similar points of view, but it's important to explore this because it is a heavily charged topic. But one of the distinctions I did want to go into is it was the 60s, the hippie days, where tune in, turn on, drop out LSD, kick the butt out of the consciousness. that pill and the birth control pill, so that women were able to manage their birth cycling process more effectively, I think really, as you say, kick out the jams, motherfucker. It really changed a major factor in changing the culture, in addition to other cultural contexts, factors going on. A lot of people in their laboratories were making synthetic versions of something we might think of as teacher plants, but they were synthetic. And they were in pill form. They were chemicals, without the context of the whole plant or much of the plant. And I think that it's a whole different mindset, tripping and ceremony, because traditional ceremony, as I've experienced in other ways, as in Sundance ceremony and the pipe ceremony, and in which is a non-psychedelic, although tobacco altered my mind. Doing the pipe. Oh, I don't know why you wouldn't call that a mind-altering substance, because I don't smoke tobacco, and we do use tobacco, but not other mind-altering substances that we think of, and it had an effect. But the pipe ceremony and also the sweat lodge were three main types of ceremonies coming from some traditional cultures that I had the opportunity to participate in. That's a whole different context, say, than sitting in a sauna. You sweat in a sauna, but in a sweat lodge, you're sweating, but you have a whole different context of what you're doing, the mindset, the consciousness. In my own training, for example, of the ceremonial basis of a sweat lodge was that you bless all the stones, you bless all the blankets covering the sweat lodge, you bless the boughs of the tree that go into forming the arches around that the blankets are put up on. So it's a whole different process. People go through a cleansing process. And so the point is, approaching some sort of physical activity in a ceremonial context really makes a real difference. I think that's a very important thing to look at. Tripping versus ceremonial use of teacher plants or teacher medicines. Do you have any thoughts on that, Penn?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, good.
And I find it really interesting. It depends on who's leading the ceremony sometimes.
Yes.
As to where the medicine takes you. The energy coming from the facilitator, the leader, the guide, whatever you want, if those energies are different, you may find yourself wandering off in the direction that the facilitator is going without really knowing it. I have had the opportunity to attend and be part of my first ayahuasca grandmother medicine ceremony not too long ago. And I went into the ceremony with the intention that I wanted to go back in and see and understand what had happened to me as a child. I have what they call disassociative. I don't remember my childhood. I wiped that thing out. It's not there. And we had 2 ayahuasca ceremonies, although I would call it one if we did ayahuasca one night, then the next night. But it was all part of a ceremony. We were encapsulated in the ceremony. And the first night I tried to control it because I'm a project manager and that's what project managers do. And so I regulated exactly the amount that the ayahuasca curandera, grandmother, was going to give me. And at the end of the day, or the end of the first night ceremony, the ceremony told me, you didn't let go. You didn't let me do my work. You don't get anything out of it. And so the next night we went into it. I am a little hard-headed, by the way. I controlled it again, and I got the same message. You have to learn to let go and let grandmother take care of you. So the journey will continue probably in April, and I will do my best to let go. But the intention that I had there was I wanted to do this work with this medicine, but I wanted to control it completely. That didn't work. The grandmother curandera, who had studied in South America for almost 20 years, warned me what was going to happen, and it happened. That falls into what you were saying a little while ago, Ray, and I'm not sure it was said when we were on this podcast or before. There are some new age people out there who will tell you they know what the hell they're doing with this stuff. I wouldn't trust them. The person that I'm working with has been doing this for a long time and was trained down in South America. We just have to be really aware of what we do when we walk with the teacher medicines, teacher plants. And for me, the most important piece of it is to be with someone I trust and I can be comfortable with. The other part of it is equally important, is that they are knowledgeable of what they are doing with the various medicines. Because after you come back from the journey, you will be getting messages. I'm still getting messages, and it's been a month and a half since I journeyed. And that grandmother curandera is still available to me to bounce stuff off of. So those are the things that are important to me.
Yeah, I agree. I have not had any direct experience of ayahuasca, which is a blend of two different plants, is my understanding. And certain procedures it's involved in making it into a drinkable substance. And I didn't say enjoyable. I didn't hear. No one said enjoyable. Just said a drinkable.
Oh, okay.
Very. So theoretically, I've developed some abilities to read energetic patterns. And so what's happened in the last 10, 20 years, a number of documentary video presentations have occurred where people are on ayahuasca journeys, usually down in the Amazon or somewhere in South America, and looking at the energetic patterns of the person leading. By the way, the word curandera, beautiful Spanish term, I love to say that word, is another word that you could say for an herbalist, as you would, and it may or may not be a shaman in terms of what I think of as a shaman, but at least they're very experienced with the herb and the plant. And that it's been a wide variation, because at one point I was hearing the ayahuasca tourism industry. People were going down in droves, in groups, group of people would go down and do 9 days of ayahuasca and come back without doing all the other ceremonies in that cultural context. But the videos of the often of the person leading it, referred to as a shaman usually, that there was a wide variation. Some were probably had some familiarity with it, and the average North American coming down, well, the person says they are a plant teacher, and so okay, and they grew up in the culture, but it's the energies and the wisdom and the experience of the shaman or the facilitator that can make a real difference, I think. Mm-hmm. And that's an important distinction. To really become a real facilitator in this, I think, would indeed take years. So that is an important distinction. And who's going to be good at this and valid and useful? It's hard to say. There's no certification program, thank goodness.
I almost threw up.
Because my perspective is there are no such things as certified shamans. You walk the path, you walk the talk, and somehow are able to facilitate others and grow energetically. So that distinction, and I think it's very important. Who leads a ceremony? And in the hippie days, we just drop a tab of acid, go out and look at the moon, look at the sun, look at the ocean, or go to the concert, and that's a whole different context of what you're talking about. At this point, I like to, I like to sort of summarize how I've observed my sense of what's been happening. How did we, as a contemporary modern day culture, expand into the use of some very traditional ceremonial contexts, the use of mushrooms, plants, etc., for thousands of years seem to be much more common than we suspect. The name that really made the real difference, I think, was a curandera. Name was Maria Sabina in Oaxaca. And in 1955, a banker and his pediatrician wife had heard about it and went down to Huautla, Mexico, in the state of Oaxaca, in Mexico. And after a while, they were able to do a ceremony with Maria Sabina. Watson came back, did a major article for Life magazine, which was a very, 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 very popular magazine at the time, and really opened the whole world to this, what some editor ended up calling magic mushroom. That was not the original name, but somebody coined that term. It sounded like an editor at the Life magazine, and that became the term of choice, although it's the main drug or the main chemical, and that is psilocybin, one of many chemical compounds in the certain type of mushroom that has an effect upon our consciousness when we ingest it. And anyway, that seemed to open the door, that article in Life magazine. And so there's all sorts of legend about the Beatles and Bob Dylan going down to Maria Sabina in Oaxaca, and the popularization of this type of a teacher plant, which is different than ayahuasca, which is different than peyote, but they're traditional plants and have been used apparently in ceremony for hundreds or thousands of years. So that comes into the culture, and in the hippie days, Timothy Leary comes along and says, tune in, turn on, and drop out. And the legitimacy of being a Harvard professor. And so it becomes fairly simple for a university grad student in chemistry to produce this, and it becomes in a little pill, which is very manageable and legal at the time because they didn't think of it as being illegal. Then a fear factory came in, and because of theoretically some possible negative consequences, and so it became illegal to do research, to do therapy, because LSD and psilocybin were being used to facilitate psychotherapy. And research was being done, and then suddenly it just dried up. It became one of those taboo topics. Came back in somewhere in around 2000, I think it was. And since then, some major books, if people want to read a contemporary view of this, I think it's important to look at them. We'll come back to the teacher plants in a moment. A book by Merlin Sheldrake entitled Entangled Life, just 2020. He's a mycologist, a beautiful, beautiful spirit, beautiful writing. I hold him in very high regard. But the one that just kicked out the jams was Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, subtitled, What the New Science of Psychedelics Teaches Us About Consciousness, Dying, Addiction, Depression, and Transcendence. Michael Pollan in 2018 came out with that book. I've read it about 3 times now. It's very, very informative. And then he came out again in 2021, last year. This is Your Mind on Plants. And there's been a big conference earlier this year on the internet about fungi, mushrooms, the magic mushroom, and other uses of all mushrooms. So what I'm trying to say is here, there's been a revival, a renaissance of looking at the chemistry of mind alteration, and that has been being supported by a scientific criteria, which may or may not be valid, but criteria of facilitating psychological transformation. And it's starting to be legitimized more and more. But there we have that in the medical context, with usually 2 people leading a person through a guided experience with LSD, psilocybin, or MDMA. It seemed to be the 3 popular ones. So it's a whole nother ballgame that really seemed to have started back with Maria Sabina in 1955, kicking out the jams, a whole new perspective. And so that's a context for us to look at this in. And so the question is, where are we going to go with this? And you've had the opportunity to be in traditional cultural ceremony, which is different than tripping, which is different than the really facilitated
sterile medical is what I think of.
Yeah. But they seem to be being effective to some extent, to some time, for dealing with some really challenging emotional, psychological situations. Do you have any thoughts on that? Where we're going in the culture, which is not going to be doing it in a real traditional ceremony. That's just outside of most of our cultural opportunities. We just don't. What you were talking about is just not going to be available to most people, or it's being available in a very perhaps superficial, limited way by people who may not be very experienced and very wise, and may not be very energetically developed. Do you have any reflections or thoughts on any of that?
What I find is interesting is in this conversation, we're talking about hundreds of years ago. We'll just say hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
Thousands. These teacher plants were used for a myriad of things by skilled medicine people, shamans, and to bring them forward. Much like the Native American traditions that were outlawed here in the United States until 1973.
Yeah.
These medicines were repressed also.
Yes. No sweat lodge, no Sundance ceremony.
No vision quest, none of that.
None of that.
In that whole lump of natural way of doing things, we took away the natural way of using plants in their native state, i.e. ayahuasca, i.e. marijuana, peyote, just to name a few. We're starting to figure out that Mother knows best. And part of the group that the grandmother Culandera is leading, some of the folks in there are actually leading the charge in the state that I live in to legalize the medical use of MDMA and psilocybin for PTSD issues. We've already legalized medical use of marijuana. There's so much to learn just from that. And even if it's done in what I refer to as a sterile medical environment, and this is me wanting to believe this, okay? Me wanting to believe that when a veteran who has PTSD is going in there in a prayer in their heart that says, I need help. Is there some help here? And so at the very superficial edge of what's going on, that's a ceremony. That's a prayer. When that veteran or when that homeless person or when that person who is having psychological issues goes in and says, I need something. Can I be helped? And that plant steps forward and says, yes, I will help you. To me, there's a level of a prayer and a ceremony in that. They may not know it. They may not go, I've just had a ceremony. I've smudged. I've danced, whatever. That person has come to that plant humbly looking for help. They might be screaming out of their mind, but they are humbly asking for help from that plant.
Yeah, so there's still that ceremonial flavor that's sort of underneath some of the cultural limitations, but it's still with that tone. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah. I want to share my experience with, I'll call it teacher plants, as well as synthetic chemical compounds that have a mind-altering. The term used, becoming popular today, is psychedelic.
Yeah.
So we could call it a psychedelic, and that's the term is usable. And whether it refer to the as in a natural plant form or in a synthesized chemical compound taken as a pill or perhaps some other way, that in hippie days, I had, I would say somewhere between 20 and 30 trips, two of which were natural substances. The rest of them were synthetic pills. And I got to the place where, I'm tired of taking a pill to go to these spaces, which after a while seem similar. I'm getting less and less benefit. And it did have some very powerful, meaningful, I would say meaningful experiences. But I got to the point where I said, using Huxley's, Aldous Huxley's concept of opening the doors of perception, a very important book, somewhere in maybe the 50s or 60s, and where he talked about use of mescaline and opening the doors of perception, how we perceived experience differently, and it had a profound effect upon him. I found that after a while, is this as good as it's going to get? I want to go deeper. I want to go deeper. And I shifted from doing any sort of mind-altering substance to the way I call it, putting my ass on the meditation mat, daily meditative practice, which also could include the Sundance ceremony, the Sweat Lodge ceremony, the Sacred Pipe ceremony. My observation has been this, based on my own experience, and watching several documentaries of people on this, and having some ability, theoretically, to be able to read energy patterns. In the ayahuasca ceremonies, and I want to see what you think of this perspective, it's often been stated that what makes the difference is the spirit of the plant interacting with the person. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's the factor of the person leading it as well. And also there's the biological factor of the chemistry of that plant having effect on people. As I've heard, people have a lot of intestinal processes go on when they take ayahuasca, for example. But what I kept getting again and again and again, it was not so much the chemical compounds of the plant. It was not so much the teacher, the facilitator. It was not the spirit of the plants, but rather it was a different type of being entirely, which is a very, very common type of being called spirit helper, and I call them nature beings. The little people, they show up in our photography today as orbs of light, and that they are very powerful. They are sort of vibrating at some ways that we vibrate, but they do not embody, they do not go into physical form. And that they can go inside our physical form to interact with our energetic form. And they are the ones, they really are the ones that are facilitating the greatest amount of change, transformation. It's been these other types of beings I just keep seeing again and again and again, the emotional change. And so I've not heard it presented this way, but what I keep perceiving is the other types of beings are really the movers and the shakers. And that when people take these mind-altering substances, and particularly if they are plant-based rather than pill-based, there's much more going on, and that the transformation it's like it's the opening up of suppressed energetic functioning that opens up, and the flow of insights, understandings, the emotional release is much more due to what those types of beings are facilitating than any other factor. That's just been my observation, and I wasn't expecting that. I was trying to say, okay, it's the ayahuasca plant being, but I didn't perceive it as such. Do you have, no one, I've not said this to anyone hardly ever, but do you have any thoughts on that perspective? Being other types of beings, they're not harmful beings. They're playful. They're very playful. They enjoy energy. They come into all ceremonies.
I'm going to real quickly say they do come into all ceremonies. And I'll get to the ayahuasca ceremony in just a minute. Part of the things that were shared with me is a healing sweat lodge. And in the healing sweat lodge, typically it would be someone who would come in who was trying to let go of alcohol or a drug. And I always instructed my doorkeeper, fire tender and doorkeeper, stay away from the door. And in one of the ceremonies, physically saw the drug spirit get up and leave the lodge, opened the door and went out the lodge. And the fire tender saw it also. So beings being there, the person who I was helping in the sweat lodge, the person holding the person, myself and the fire tender all saw the same being leave the lodge. So there's credence to that in my own personal experience. During the ayahuasca ceremony, it's in the dark because ayahuasca likes to work in the dark. Ayahuasca is a fire being. But we could look around the inside of the room that we were in. And the curandera, I knew where hypothetically, I knew where she was.
That's the live human being.
That's the live human being. She was moving around in the room and singing through the whole thing, singing various songs. But there were other beings in the room. Not the people that were participants, but there were other beings in the room. And you could see them. And most of the people, there were, I think, about a dozen of us. Everybody saw the same beings. So it almost felt like when I was having a real hard time, one of them came over and I almost felt the touch, just saying, "You're okay."
Mm.
So it goes beyond in there for me. It was the first time I ever actually had, well, no, it's not. That's not true. But it was as if that being was right there saying, "It's okay. Just stay with this. You're all right." So that's the work that's done. And I'll probably in April go back and continue what I call the ceremony. Because I think it's not, ceremonies are never done. I take that back. I'll let go of that.
Yeah, I understand.
It's not over. But yes, it's hard not to acknowledge that there are beings in there. And all the native cultures that I'm familiar with, every one of them acknowledge that there are beings that attend ceremonies that are not physical of this world.
Yeah. And I think it's important for listeners and viewers to understand what is shamanic. Shamanic culture is one of the things for me to call a shamanic culture, and my observation is that there's an acknowledgement of other types of beings that are not demonic, aren't God, aren't an angel, but other types of beings. And that's sort of standard. I think for those of us who in mainstream contemporary culture grew up in the world that I grew up in as a Christian perspective, that we need to step into a whole expanded consciousness and awareness and embrace of other types of beings. And I'm not referring to disembodied human spirits known as ghosts. Now, these are different types of beings, generally, and that they're powerful and they can greatly facilitate. And that's why they're often referred to as spirit helpers. They're an important part of a ceremony. So if you ever go into a sweat lodge, just be open to, this seems different.
Guess who's here?
Yeah, and invite them in.
Yeah.
So that's an important aspect of contemporary culture in contrast to what many of us refer to as shamanic culture, which can vary from over time. Different cultures clearly have different languaging, different perspectives, but it's pretty common to include that. Other thoughts you have in terms of suggestions for people who either dealing with some sort of a limited psychological emotional context or want to grow into an expanded consciousness and using the teacher plants, teacher medicines as one of the methodologies. Because I want to say, I think it's really important not to make this the path. It's an important part of the path. And it's, unfortunately, when many of us contemporary people go down to South America, we go in and do the ayahuasca ceremony, but we're not there the rest of the year doing all the other ceremonies to have that greater cultural context. And that is a major limitation, I think. It's that greater cultural context, which is so important to become aware of. Do you have any suggestions, perspectives for people? Because it's becoming popular. It's going to become more and more popular in the culture. I don't think the ayahuasca plants are so easily grown in North American ecology, but psilocybin mushrooms, they're all over the place. You can grow them in your own home, is my understanding. And so they're very accessible. And fairly easy to apparently to grow. Do you have any suggestions for people who might be stepping into different cultural contexts?
I'm going to do a flip.
Yep.
On your, you, from what I just heard, used medicines in the early 60s and 70s.
Yep.
And what I think I heard you say was, is that all there is? I need to get my ass on the meditation mat.
Yes, that's it. Yes. I felt as I could go as far, I mean, without, it was diminishing returns by doing it, at least for me at that time.
So I'm on the other side of that coin.
Yeah.
I spent all my life, and for sure since 1996 up until 2 years ago, meditation, Sundance, all those things that did not include teacher medicines or teacher plants. I finally retired 2 years ago. And so I am on this path of exploring, will the magic mushroom, will ayahuasca enhance the foundation that I already have?
Yeah.
I was in the commercial nuclear world. I'm really cautious. So when I talk about going and doing any of these things, if a person's listening to this podcast and said, well, Ray said, and Penn said, and I'll just go grab myself a fistful of magic mushrooms, or I'll go find somebody to do an ayahuasca ceremony, or I'm going to go take a fistful of MDMA or LSD and see where it takes me. Number one, when you make that decision, please make sure you have a guide with you who's been there before.
Good idea.
So that you don't take off all your clothes and go dancing down the street singing everything is beautiful. Vaya, my Lord. So those are the things that, these are just safety things. And this is from somebody who's been cautious all their life. If you're going to go do that, going to follow the path, make sure you're with someone who's been down the path and who is of like mind for you, to be able to talk with you if something gets feeling a little funny, to help you relax back into it and let the medicine or the plant relax back into you. Keep a log. Write down how much you took, what you took, where you were, and how you felt afterwards, and what happened during. Those are just, I mean, these are simple things, but I was very careful before I tried my first little cap of mushroom, and I had a very good guide. And I recommend that everybody do it as safely as possible.
I concur with your suggestions here, because we're not going to often find an 20-year experience curandera, either here or even in South America sometimes, yeah. Probably, from what I hear. And yeah, because as we step into new territory, cultural territory, how do we do it safely and wisely? Because we didn't do it very wise and respectfully. Yes, that's an important factor. So it's just not just chemistry. It's not just an aspirin or a caffeine stay awake pill. There's much more to be gained from the potentiality. The language is coming out of the medical scientific literature is that at least in the brain, there is the changes in the default mode network, the way that the brain functions. It sort of like blows it open. And so new possibilities of examining and experiencing can become available to us because our standard of defense mechanisms and standard, this is how we're going to deal with it, this is how we're going to perceive it, just sort of gets expanded. It goes into alternative, uncertain, unknown mode. And out of that comes this great inspiration sometimes of where we were not willing to look before. That's from the chemistry of it. But how we do that, it's going to be important. If we go back into something like in the 60s where everybody was doing everybody dropping a tab, and because I see that coming down the line more and more. Mm-hmm. And to do it wisely. And again, my perspective, to sum up, is it's not the path. It can be part of the path if it's right for you. And for me, it's like, okay, 40 years ago, that was the last time. I don't anticipate doing it again. And I'm thankful for those experiences. Some were profound, some were very challenging, and some were tripping away, listening to the Doors, music, soaring around.
Watching Fantasia.
Or something like that, yes, yeah. Or going to watch Yellow Submarine movie. This feels like pretty complete at this point, just sort of exploration of this. There's no final answer. We've had two different paths, journeys into this, and we both found it positive, and we're both in different places regarding that at this point. Any thoughts you'd like to share to complete? I think I feel it brings to the completion point of this conversation. There's more to discuss, of course, but
no, I just be safe out there.
Yeah.
Go forth and amuse the gods and goddesses.
So, Penn Baker in the American Southwest, who is for me, a spirit that explores and someone I pay attention to say, she's looking at it this way. That's an important way for me to consider viewing, looking at, experiencing, to see how that might fit in for me at this point in time. Again, there's no right way, wrong way, absolute answer. It's spiritual growth, energetic growth is, well, you buy a ticket and now you go for the ride and see where it takes you, and be open to gaining, learning, experiencing that in depth. Because no telling what suddenly, oh my goodness, I've not been relating to it or thinking about it that way. And that may be something to pay attention to. Good. So Penn, thank you so much for joining in. We didn't go into the topic of sexuality, but to me, it's all related, in different facets of this same exploration, and gender, sexuality, mind-altering substances or teacher plants. I think it's all can be factors in our path of the growth, going beyond our cultural embargoes, going beyond our cultural limitations, going beyond our psychological limitations to being more of what we can be. Now, I'll sum it up with that. Great. Penn, thank you for suggesting we continue on with looking at another important concept. Our paths shall cross again. My friend, thank you.
Thank you so much. Please be well.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.